Let's get started. This is Code Webinar 4. My name is Molly McCoy, and just to give you a little background on who I am, I've been in P&O for 20 years. I was in clinical practice, then I taught lower extremity prosthetics at University of Washington, and now I own and operate McCoy Consulting. And the goal of McCoy Consulting is to help practitioners learn new ways to document without totally disrupting their current practice and making documentation into a full-time job, which we don't want it to be. And SPS, as a company, contracts with my company to help their customers. So they hire me to help their customers in these really tough, complex times. It's hard to keep up with everything. So that's what SPS is trying to do, is help their customers do better business. So that's me. What we're going to cover today in this webinar is really cool. Finally, some orthotics in these things. We're going to talk about two different AFOs, two different AFO cases, both in complex review, and some different aspects of each. Should be very interesting, have some good tips and some good information. So let's talk about case number 1. You don't have much paperwork in your handouts there about case number 1, because we're just going to do a quick overview about it and point out some specific details of what went on with this one. But it's regarding a person who had a left side CVA and then needed an L1960, a regular custom AFO. And this person, there was a progression that happened that maybe was not ideal, but is very common. So what happened was the patient was in physical therapy after the CVA in a long-term care facility, and the PT says, wow, this person really needs an AFO. So the PT then calls the orthotist in this case and says, hey, we need an AFO. Can you come and take a look? And again, this is pretty common. This probably happened to you multiple times, and it definitely used to be standard practice. You would come take a look at that patient, assess them for an AFO, maybe cast them there, and take care of everything. And then the doctor would come later and say, okay, yep, I agree with everything you did, and sign off. And that's pretty much what happened here. So in this case, the practitioner was wondering, how come this claim went to complex review? You know, was it something wrong with the paperwork? Does the practitioner have a history of billing issues with 1960? Was it something like that? That's not the case. For right at this time in this region, the DME MAC, in this case Noridian, had sent in a newsletter. Hopefully you're on these newsletter lists from your regional carrier. And saying that they were going to do a widespread complex review of L1970, 1960, and 4360. They did that review, and here's the oldest story. You've heard this so many times. In the case of 1960, the review had 232 claims, and 199 of those claims were denied. Of course, that's a huge improper payment rate, and CMS will continue the reviews. So that's all to say, you know, again, you've heard this story before. You've seen these widespread complex reviews. But that's all to say, if the practitioner maybe or their staff had seen that newsletter announcement saying, hey, there's going to be a review of these particular codes, that should be sort of a red flag for them to take a step back and think, well, you know, of course we're going to button up our policies on everything we do, but right now maybe we should go ahead and focus on really getting our paperwork in tip-top shape for these particular codes. So they might sit down in a practitioner meeting or in an all-staff meeting and say, guess what? They just announced that they're going to be doing a widespread complex review of these codes. So let's all review as a group what needs to happen. What do we need to have for our paperwork for these codes going forward? And potentially they could have lessened the result for everybody could have been better, but really the result for them could have been better too, because a widespread review would have highlighted how well this practice is doing in these particular for these particular codes. So it could have been a good thing to know ahead of time and to sort of plan for. In this case, which is so often the case, everyone's super busy. They didn't do that, and so they had some paperwork issues that we're going to talk about going forward here. So they got the standard letter, and if you haven't ever seen one of these letters, yay for you. But I think most people have seen this letter where they want all this information. Please submit the following. We're not going to focus right now in this webinar on the detailed written order, the proof of delivery, or the dispensing order, but I do want to quickly note some issues that came up with those for this case, and then we'll really focus on the clinical part of it, or the clinical notes. Okay, so let's talk about some of the details here on the paperwork. And I would say hopefully we have a lot of practitioners listening to this today, because although this says administrative at the top, this is not just the domain of your front office people. If practitioners don't understand what is required to get everything put through on a claim properly, then there's no way the administrative staff can get it all together. It just, if one person in the team doesn't understand how to play the game, then the whole team is going to lose, right? So in this case, I would say, yes, we're talking about administrative issues, but the practitioner has to be on board with this. So if you're still that practice or that practitioner that says, oh, I don't worry about that, I just let the front office handle it, what you're really hurting the whole practice by doing that. It really is important now in 2014 to understand the administrative side of this, to understand the Medicare billing policies and whatever other insurance you're dealing with, their policies as well. So let's talk about kind of some issues here. Firstly, the dispensing order was incorrect in this case. It has to be from the physician. So the dispensing order has to come from the physician. It can be verbal. So if the physician had called and said, would you go over to that long-term care facility and see this patient for an AFO, because the PT called me and asked for it or whatever, that would be fine. But in this case, and is so often the case, the PT called. So the PT called the orthotist and said, hey, can you come over here and see this person? I think she needs an AFO. And that was, in this case, going to be used for the dispensing order, but that doesn't work. So what really needed to happen for this one is they should have called the doctor at that point and said, hey, the PT called, but can you give us a dispensing order, either verbally or written, that says we can go ahead and see this person for an AFO. So that's one problem with this case. The other thing that went wrong is that in this case, the proof of delivery was wrong. The signature was in the wrong place. So you can see here, the person actually signed over on the date line. The patient signed on the date line. Now, of course, I've marked out the signature, but it was there. So the patient did sign, but they signed on the date line and then put this little arrow over to where it should have been and then dated it underneath. Not so great. So here's a case where the practitioner, not understanding the importance of that signature and how it could be a reason or one of the reasons for denial, went and said, here, patient, we've done this. Now, could you sign? The patient signs and he goes, shucks, you didn't do it right. We'll just draw a little arrow. We're good. Now, I can only imagine he goes back to the office and his administrative staff says, it's wrong. You didn't have him sign in the right spot. And the practitioner saying, what's the big deal? The signature's on there. It's totally obvious that the patient signed it. Why is that such a problem? It's such a problem because, as you know, Medicare is looking for any excuse. They're really honing in on P&O specifically, and they're really cracking down on these rules. That signature has to be right. And so if it's not right, it's going to be an issue. So again, there's where the practitioner, had they known really the importance of getting the signature correct, could have saved us another ding on this denial. And then lastly, the detailed written order was incorrect. So here's a picture of it. You can see where the doctor's name printed underneath actually said, I'll make up a name here, Joe M. Smith instead of Joe W. Smith, or in this case, the other way around. But you get the idea. The middle initial on the type part of the name was incorrect. And then there's that little line with an arrow, and then, it should have been an M, and it's written there. Not really good enough. So again, is this, could they deny on these issues alone? Could those three problems cause a denial? Technically, yeah, they actually could. Is that right? Well, maybe not. Is it, crazy because everything else was right, or it's not like it's fraud, the patient did need the orthosis and everything else was pretty good. But the bottom line is technically they could deny just on those issues. So it's really got to get buttoned up. You really have to get these things exactly right. Could you correct it after submission? Could we go in afterwards and say, hey, we submitted, it was denied. They said, these signatures weren't right. So you go back to the patient and say, could you sign another one of these? And then, do it correctly this time, but date it for today. You see where I'm going. This could really open a can of worms that maybe isn't, going to help you potentially. It's gray whether that would help you or not. And also it's a pain in the neck for everybody. So it really has to be right on the first shot. And it's these little detail things that'll catch you. And the point really is, we hear so often, and I've been there absolutely myself as a practitioner, saying, you know, this is crazy. The person needed an AFO. They clearly are going to benefit from this AFO. The doctor's clearly on board because he signed off on everything. You know, the PT wrote great notes. How can they possibly deny on these little administrative problems? But the fact is, if your paperwork isn't perfect going in, then you can't really have too much righteous indignation about it getting denied, right? You kind of have to say, you know, my paperwork was wrong, my bad, you know, and you kind of make your paperwork as perfect as you can get it before you start saying, you know, oh, this is wrong, it was denied for this patient and they should have had it. It's true, they should have had it, but again, if the paperwork's off, it's off. Going back to this case and the notes in this case, this is really the hinge of this one, or the issue of this one. What's going on with the notes? Are they good enough or not? And this is a funky gray area that is really hard to understand at this stage, I believe. The therapist notes in this case were really good. They had a lot of detail. The doctor's chart note said nothing about an AFO or issues with walking or anything like that. The doctor was basically leaving it up to the PT and the orthotist to figure things out. So what we have is, you know, if you're sitting there with two sets of notes, one says nothing that's helpful and the other one has a lot of detail on the AFO, then you might say, well, hey, technically by Medicare rules, the therapist notes are good enough to show justification. They are enough medical record to show that the patient needed the AFO and that everything is supported from the LCD. Technically, that may or may not be right. We're going to talk about that in a second. But the bottom line is we still want to get the doctor's notes, even though they may not have any detail about it. And I want to be very clear here on an area that is not very clear. You would still get those doctor's notes. You would still submit both the doctor's and the therapist's notes. But what you need to do in this case is explain the situation. Pull whatever information you can from the doctor's note. Maybe there's something about medication. Maybe there's something about strength or stability, what have you, in the doctor's general note, even though they didn't go into detail about the need for an AFO. Then you combine that with the therapist's note that does have a bunch of detail and your note that brings them both together and ties the whole thing into a care plan. All of those together could be really substantial and beneficial. But just turning in your notes, and in this case, the orthotist notes were not very helpful. They didn't have maybe the right information. And the therapist notes, which had great information but are still therapist notes, was maybe not enough, right? So let's go into detail about why that may or may not be enough to have those therapist notes. I'm going to be really honest here. I find this incredibly frustrating and confusing, and I'm sure it'll come through in my voice as that. But let's look at what we've heard so many times before. That part of the LCD and a bunch of other print information from CMS that says the medical record is not limited to the physician's office records, but can include records from a bunch of other people, right? And the supplier records alone are not enough. So what I have always said, and what makes sense to me, and what I've heard on CMS training seminars and calls, and what they've said to me over the phone, and all of that kind of thing, that makes sense to me, is that that means that other healthcare notes can be used as support for an orthosis or a prosthesis as information in the medical record, meaning that therapist notes can be enough, right? And that's what we've said. That's what I've heard. That's what I believed. Then I'm seeing a bunch of denials, I shouldn't say a bunch, quite a few denials from people all over the country who have submitted with just therapist notes and their notes to support a prosthesis or an orthosis. And they get denied because there's nothing in the doctor's note. So what is right? I mean, if in my case, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, I don't understand. If it specifically says that those medical records can be from all these other people, but then it denies because there's nothing in the doctor's note, then it should say the doctor is the only one that can have it in their chart note. Well, then I'm fishing around trying to find if that's the case, and I find this line, this top line, where it says, This is a publication from CMS to physicians saying that it is the physician's responsibility as the ordering physician to determine and document the medical need for all healthcare services. So to me, that statement is saying they are the end gatekeeper. If it's not in their notes, if it's not in the physician's notes, then all other notes are secondary. All other notes are not enough. And again, I would say that seems a little gray to me because the bottom statement seems to contradict the top statement. However, if we're taking the really conservative approach, then looking at these two statements, it's fairly clear enough that really you need the doctor's notes. So yes, we have great therapist notes in this case. Yes, we have, okay orthotist notes, but we really need to get something from the doctor. And that's, you can debate that in your own practices. You can look into that for yourself and decide what's going to be right for you in your practice. If I were in practice right now, I feel like I would be having the staff meeting to say, guess what, kids? It's not enough to have therapist notes alone anymore. We've really got to have those doctor's notes. So, and we're going to talk more about in-servicing doctors or how we can get better notes at the end of this webinar. So stay tuned for that. So the plan in this case, give up, right? We don't have the right notes. We don't have the information that's needed. The doctor's not going to give it to us. And even if he did, it's too late. So let me tell you why you don't just walk away from this. You don't look at these notes or listen to what I'm saying and go, we didn't have the doctor's notes. We didn't have good therapy, or we had decent therapist notes, but all we have is a doctor sign off. So now that it's in complex review, forget it. We're just going to, ignore the whole thing and let it go because we were wrong. You just can't do that. And this is why. In the Program Integrity Manual, and you can look up this section if you want, it says that if you don't respond to the additional documentation request for the complex review, and in this case, if we're looking at this case, we might say, we're not going to respond or we're not going to send what we have because we recognize it's not good enough and it doesn't meet the requirements. That is worse than sending what you do have, right? If you send nothing, it's a problem. And again, I'm going to point to this Program Integrity Manual statement you see here that says that any supplier who shows a pattern of failing to comply with requests for additional documentation for claims submitted to CMS might be subject to complex medical review for all their claims. That's a sanction, right? That is a penalty. So they're going to say, gosh, you're showing a pattern of every time we put complex review through and we ask you for more information, you show a pattern of not responding to that with the information we're asking for. So we are going to sanction you. We're going to punish you. And we're going to mark in our computer that your practice, you as a practitioner, shall have all of your claims going forward reviewed in complex medical review. So you have just been penalized for not actually giving them the information that they were looking for, giving them the information that you have. That's a problem, right? You could be set up to have every single claim you send in sent to complex review. That would be bad. So hopefully you're saying to yourself at this point, what's a pattern, right? What do they consider a pattern? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 50? And then after you've had 50 complex medical review additional documentation requests that you didn't respond to, they say, okay, now we're going to put you through complex review for all of them. Here's the scoop. In this case, and you can read it in this section, a pattern is 2 or more additional documentation requests that go unanswered. 2! That's the pattern. So if you have, and this is the case for some people, right? They look at this and they go, this is a low dollar claim. How, I'm not going to make any money on this now because I'm going to spend so much time putting together this paperwork. Here's the fact. If you don't put together that paperwork and you don't submit at least what you have not responded to that additional documentation request. And if you do that 2 times, that's a pattern. And you could be sanctioned. You could be put on that list of people who get everything reviewed. Now you're really creating work for yourself. Now you're really in a hole that's going to be hard to climb out of. So the answer is to all of these, answer the request. Right? If they ask you for more documentation and you notice your documentation is deficient, do something, write something, explain something, give them what you have. It may not be enough, it may not be perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than ignoring the request. And then guess what? You just had a great lesson that next time you're going to get the right info before you bill it. And that's huge. So you get the right info going forward, you make the correction. But again, if you don't respond, you're really hurting yourself. So are we still guilty here? Is this practice still guilty of not having what they should have had? Yeah, we're guilty. It's a problem. We made a mistake. But guess what? You want to be guilty of a mistake, not guilty of fraud. So if we didn't respond to the additional documentation request, there's a chance, and that happens more than a few times, there's a chance they could say, clearly this place is fraudulent. This practice, this practitioner is trying to get away with something because they're not giving us the info we want. When in reality, it's not that we're trying to get away with anything. It's just that we didn't understand the requirements completely. We couldn't get compliance from the doctor. We were in a bad situation. We're super busy and we couldn't get the info, right? And so we said, well, gosh, we don't have the right info. Forget it. That could be construed differently on their end. So if we look at this case from the reviewer's point of view, right, it may be denied even though, but that's a short-term problem. That's bad for us. We got denied on this one. We're not going to get paid. That's bad for our business, right? But if we do it wrong where we don't submit the information, that's really bad for your practice if you look at it in the long range view, right? Long term, if you do that many times and you don't respond and you don't give them what you have, then you could be in much worse shape than if you get dinged by not getting the information and getting that single denial. Okay, so deep breath, that was that first case. Now we're going to move into case number 2 and talk about some other detail in these notes. So again, put on a different hat. This is a whole separate case. We're going to kind of start over here. This has some similar issues, but a little bit different, and we're going to dive into some different areas of this case. So in this case, we have someone with Charcot-Marie tooth, who's wearing bilateral AFOs. And notice here the person got bilateral AFOs in December of 2007, in December of 2012, and then in June of 2014, they're asking for another pair of bilateral AFOs. That's a pretty quick turnaround on that second, or on that last set, right? So that's just something to note. And then notice also we had 2 different delivery dates. So the left was delivered on the 2nd of June and the right wasn't delivered until the 19th of June. That was because they were waiting for bandages to be removed. There was a debridement and a surgery, and they were waiting on the right side, and they were waiting for the bandages to come off before finishing up or before taking a good cast of the right and finishing that one up. So these were both 1960s, and this is from the same practice that we talked about in case number 1. So they're in the same jurisdiction D, which means that all of those L1960 claims are getting reviewed, again, because of that widespread prepayment or widespread review of all 1960 claims. So positive things about this case, we have ortho notes, meaning orthopedic surgeon notes. We have podiatry notes, and we have wound care clinic notes. Yay! So not only do we have doctor's notes this time, but we have a lot of doctor's notes. Bad things about this case, the orthotist notes are handwritten. It's a problem. I am going to beat this dead horse, so just be aware going forward. I'm going to talk about this and you'll see why. Okay, so as I said, same thing here. We got a complex review for this L1960 because they were doing the widespread complex review at this time. So that's why it was pulled. But I want to throw in a side note here. I've had a couple of different calls, and now it's only 2, but it's such an ugly thing that I want to bring it up. I've heard some people say that their competition, right, other P&O practices in their area, are telling their doctors, their referring doctors, to send patients to them and because they won't require so much paperwork from the doctor. So, and they're saying like, oh, our practice is better run. So don't worry, doctor, whatever. If you send your patients to us, you won't have such a paperwork burden. It's the reason that other practice wants all this paperwork is because they don't run their practice very well, or they're not doing things right. So if you send your patients to us, it'll be much easier for you. So, and of course that burns me. It should burn everyone. It's a horrible thing to say. It's a bad way to practice. It should be embarrassing to those practices that said that. I hope they're, kind of the shame on them sort of thing. It just ticks me off. But there might be a side benefit to these widespread complex reviews, right? In my mind, I'm thinking, gosh, maybe this will end up being a bit of a positive. If they complete these complex reviews, or they keep going with these complex reviews. What should happen, what should be exposed, is that those folks who made those promises, right, who basically lied to those referral doctors saying, oh, our paperwork is less than the other guy's paperwork, Medicare's audits should show that, guess what, they don't have the paperwork they need. And they're going to have to inundate those doctors with a lot of paperwork requests all at once. Whereas hopefully the rest of us who are doing it properly and asking for those doctor's notes and not taking no for an answer every single time, and not letting the doctor intimidate you by saying, well, I'm just going to send them to somebody else because they don't make me do all this paperwork. Well, guess what? There's going to be a complex review in your area. It's going to be widespread, and hopefully it's going to flush out those people who are telling those lies and making those false claims, and make it more even for everybody. So while complex review is rough, hopefully it has that side benefit. Okay, for this second case, again, we get the same letter. Please submit the following information. So that's not changed. But what we're going to focus on for the second case is really the medical records themselves and the orthotist notes. Let's run through the notes that we do have for this case. The orthopedic surgeon's note said, despite bilateral muscle weakness below the knee, the patient is ambulatory. So that's good. That's a positive thing. It's going to support what we're doing here with the AFO. And then the wound clinic note says he requires the side of a wheelchair or a walker while wearing the AFO ankle support brace. And they meant he requires that to ambulate. So that is not super supportive from wound care. That note doesn't exactly say, gosh, the AFOs are really helping him functionally. It's kind of saying, well, the AFO's there, but he still needs a walker and a wheelchair. So not great. The doctor's notes that we have so far, how are the orthotist notes in this situation? Did they fill in the gaps here? Did they explain the wound care notes? Did they focus on the functional use and overall health and wellness improvements from using an AFO that the patient will receive? No. Unfortunately, there was nothing about that. There isn't even anything about walking, nothing about ambulation. It's all focused on the process of making the orthosis and running through the key words of the LCD. So first, all of our notes have been deficient in this way for many, many years. I'm going to make that blanket statement, and then a bunch of you are going to say, not mine, not mine. That's fine. But I can say in general, almost everybody's, including my own, had always focused on saw the patient, did this, did that, fit this, put this on, and done. Our notes now need to be did this, saw this, created this, and this is why. This is what it's going to do for the patient. That last bit, so important. What are they functionally going to do with that thing? Why do they need it? Why can't they get along without it? That's what we need to kind of start adding in there. So let me just read a little bit of these notes from this orthotist about this AFO in particular. Of course, I'm just going to read sections of it. This isn't all of it. But it says, blah, 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 custom braces needed due to abnormal ankle anatomy, very high arches, secondary to contractures from CMT. That's one date. The next date, custom braces medically necessary due to abnormal anatomy, high arch, contracted midfoot, control for foot drop, all due to Charcot-Marie tooth, blah, blah, blah. Another dated entry. New AFO needed today, secondary to loss of fit and atrophy and partial foot amputation. Custom is necessary because this is a permanent condition and the patient is also diabetic. So again, you're seeing a pattern, right? And then the next entry. The brace is designed to control foot drop, ankle inversion, and does so well. An off-the-shelf brace could not work because the patient is very tall and off-the-shelf braces would be too short. Patient has cavus foot from CMT, ankle and forefoot inversion, brittle diabetes, ulcers and partial foot amputation, blah, blah, blah. Next entry. The plastic ankle foot orthosis is for ankle inversion, instability due to Charcot-Marie tooth. Off-the-shelf brace would not work and would be contraindicated because the patient has Charcot-Marie tooth, foot drop, cavus foot, and needs control in more than one plane. And this is a permanent progressive disease. For these reasons, custom AFOs are appropriate. So do you see what I'm saying here? That's great that this person put in all those keywords from the LCD. It's great that that person addressed those issues, but we're talking about multiple visits for the same item, right? That would be like the eval appointment, the casting appointment, a fitting appointment, a second fitting appointment, etc., delivery appointment, whatever. All of those appointments are basically repeating the same thing over and over and over. We get it. You know, the person needed it for those reasons. It's great you're using the LCD language, but where does the person talk about how this patient's going to use this orthosis? What is it going to do for this person functionally? Are they going to walk in it? There has not been in this entire set of notes one mention of walking, right? Or detail about where the person walks to or why they need to walk there, what that walking is going to do for them. That's where a lot of notes. This note, you love to think that this is an isolation, I'm sure. You'd love to think, oh, my notes don't do that. But I would challenge you to go back and look at your notes, even from very recently, and really with a critical eye say, wait a minute, do my notes kind of look like that too? I would bet a lot of us out there have notes that look exactly like this. It's super common. I get it all the time, and it's just not the type of detail that is necessary. It's writing the note for reimbursement explanation instead of writing the note to address the patient's functional needs and to address how this plan of care is going to benefit the patient. So moving right along with the LCD requirements in some detail, we need to show that the person needs a custom fabricated orthosis to prevent tissue damage, etc., right? And again, that was in the orthotist notes. We saw that. They definitely highlighted that point and made it clear, so that's good. Also, we have some good information in the podiatry note. On page 10 of 22 pages of information in paragraph 2, in the last line, the podiatrist says, the patient presents with extensive deformity in both lower extremities, all the classic findings of CMT, rigid pes cavus foot, and anterior equinus. Perfect. Okay, so that's great. That's good stuff. But, oh, and then they also wrote in a different area, patient is noted to have an open ulcer on the right foot. That's good too, because we're showing that there is potential for tissue damage. So good information in there. But again, I just want to pull back and challenge this. Is the reviewer going to find that information? Is the reviewer going to make the connection between patient presents with extensive deformity and has an open ulcer to therefore they need a custom AFO to prevent tissue damage? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. It's possible. Could you just highlight that section in yellow? Can you just take a highlighter and say, gosh, there's a lot of information here. I'm just going to hit this with a highlighter so that reviewer really sees this is the part that's relevant to the orthosis? No, you can't do that. As we talked about in prior webinars and other short videos, any mark that you make on the notes could obscure that information, especially in a fax or especially once it's scanned and in their system, that kind of thing. It could make it hard to read. And if you do that, it could be a problem. So they ask that you don't highlight anything, physically highlight anything or underline or all that. Could you make a cover letter instead then? Yes, you can make a cover letter. You could write a cover letter that says, guess what, Mr. or Mrs. Reviewer, on page 10 of these 22 pages, in paragraph 2 in the last line, you will find the support for the need for a custom fab orthosis to prevent tissue damage. There it is, right? Could you do the next thing? Okay, so cover letter is good. Could you take it to the next level and do what's even better? Could you incorporate that into your notes? That's ideal. So now, instead of a cover letter that says, here's all the information and let me explain it to you, even better would be in your notes to say, I've evaluated the patient, I've received the notes from the doctor, and guess what? In the podiatry note, page 10, paragraph 2, last line, I see that there's support from the podiatrist for a custom fab orthosis that will prevent tissue damage because of this, this, and this. It's in your notes, tying together the notes from the other providers. That's the perfect, ideal setup. I'm not going to say perfect, but that's a good setup, right? And that's what we're shooting for. Okay, so we've already established that the orthotist note actually said a lot about the need for custom fabrication to prevent tissue damage and why. But guess what? I was reading that off of a typed sheet that I dictated for that orthotist. What the orthotist gave to me was handwritten notes. I'm going to show you these handwritten notes. Here they are, right? And now hopefully you're saying, oh, wow, I can't even read that. Here's the other one. Can't read that either, right? Really tough to read. What I ended up doing is reading this, and again, I'm an orthotist, so I know what he's getting at. I can see the abbreviations. I get the general progression, but the person reviewing this case is not an orthotist, 99.9% chance that they're not an orthotist. So they don't get the connection, and that's if that reviewer will even look at this. So before you start saying, oh, wow, that handwriting's so awful, good thing my handwriting is so legible, guess what? It's not. Okay, so even if your handwriting is better than what you're seeing here, it's still handwritten, and that's not good enough. It's still not legible enough. The best thing is typed notes. We have to start dictating, y'all. It is time to start dictating. So if you are still handwriting your notes and you're saying, well, I'm not going to dictate, but I'll sure work on my handwriting so it doesn't look like this one. I'm going to write more clearly. You're not. Nobody is. Your handwriting's bad. Everybody's handwriting is bad, especially once it's been scanned and faxed and put through the ringer a bunch of times. It's even worse. It's hard enough to read typed notes once they've been scanned or faxed or copied or whatever. So we're already, making it difficult with all of our digital conversion of all this. We have to start dictating. You have to get it in print. Okay, so that's just hugely important. Again, I would challenge you to have, if you think your notes are so legible, if you think your handwriting's so great, so it's okay if you still handwrite, take that note and give it to your grandma, and let's see if she can actually read it. Betcha she can't. Okay, so, and now I can hear you right now, you're all saying, but our notes don't matter. They don't read our notes, so who cares what they look like? Who cares if they're legible? They don't seem to matter when you have them and they're legible and your stuff still gets denied because you don't have the information. Then it seems like, well, heck, they didn't even read my note. Who knows if they read it or not? I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. But the point is, they certainly could be an excuse to deny it. So whether they're reading them or not, if you don't submit something legible and you don't submit something that makes sense, they can certainly use that as a reason to deny. And just to highlight that point, here again is a quote from that Program Integrity Manual. Here's the section. You can look it up for yourself. For Medicare to consider coverage and payment for any item, the information submitted from the supplier by the supplier must corroborate the documentation in the medical record and confirm that Medicare's coverage criteria has been met. So again, you may turn in fabulous doctor's notes, amazing therapist notes, all of your forms are correct, but your handwritten notes are illegible. And that could be a reason to deny because you didn't corroborate in your notes. So again, I would say if you think your notes don't matter, they so do. Make sure that they're legible. Okay, this is something that has been nagging at me for a very long time. It's just been bothering me. Everybody says, well, we'll take care of this handwriting issue. We'll make sure that all the information gets into the record. We'll make sure we don't forget anything because we're busy and we're trying to go fast and what have you. And we'll skip this whole making a clear argument and explaining ourselves in a narrative form. We'll just use a template. So is it or is it not okay? And that's kind of the nagging issue. So I think I finally figured out the answer, at least as close as we can get to a real solid black and white answer from our Medicare Program Integrity Manual. And guess what? It's new. So again, here's a quote from the Medicare Program Integrity Manual. There's the section it's in. You can look it up. And note the date. Implementation of this rule started in 2013. So I challenge those out there who are saying, oh, I've always used a template. I've never had a problem with it. I've always used the check boxes. It seems to be fine. I would challenge you to look at that Program Integrity Manual and see this 2013 thing and say, oh, you know what? Maybe it has always worked in the past, but it's starting to not work. This is why. Because this changed. This is new information. This is an addition to the Program Integrity Manual in 2013. So especially as a practitioner, we're less likely to have read the updated version of the manual, and we might be operating on old assumptions. We might be operating on old rules that are no longer the case. So let's just look here at what it says. It says in the Integrity Manual now, Program Integrity Manual now, some templates provide limited options or limited space for the collection of information, like checkboxes or predefined answers or limited boxes to enter additional information, etc. CMS discourages the use of such templates. So let's stop right there. Discourages the use of such templates. They have not said you cannot use those templates. So absolutely, you could use templates. Apparently, it is not against the policy or against the rules at all. However, I would say if they are discouraging that and they're telling you that it's not a great idea, why would you continue doing it? We use the templates to guide us in our evaluation to make sure we don't forget anything, but we follow that template up with a narrative note that brings all the information from the template into a complete story, a complete narrative that explains what the patient needs and how the orthosis or prosthesis fills that need. Okay, this same section of the Program Integrity Manual goes on to say that the claim review experience from CMS shows that the limited space templates often fail to capture sufficient detailed clinical information to demonstrate that all the coverage and coding requirements are met. So they just are saying over and over in these regulations that they don't give the level of detail that Medicare wants. And guess what? They are tracking you. So if every single quote unquote narrative note that you put in looks the same but in a different order, you could be hurting yourself with that. So you're saying, well, yeah, I use checkboxes, but then in the end, I get this note that has, everything kind of put together from the checkboxes into this note. But if the note says over and over the same words, but they just insert a patient's name, it's still a template. And it's still not going to have the detail that you need and not going to be specific enough potentially about the patient, that particular patient, and that particular orthosis or prosthesis. Again, we've heard that, people are getting things denied if the doctor uses a template or a checkbox or that sort of thing. It's not good enough. It's not considered part of the medical record. It has to be in their chart note. Well, here it is from the manual again. The physicians should be aware that templates that are designed to gather selected information specifically for reimbursement purposes are not going to be sufficient, or often, I should say, insufficient to demonstrate that the coverage requirements are met. And that's because the documents generally do not provide sufficient information to show the medical necessity criteria are met. What they're saying is, again, they need to know specifically about that patient. So now we're sad, right? There's no quick fix. There's no shortcut. It's a super bummer. And so what are you going to do, right? You can't use a template. You're in a super hurry. You can't get through to the doctor because they won't let you in service them. They're too busy or what have you. How are you going to make all this happen? What are you going to do to fix the problem? And, you can still educate your doctors. And again, I would say you're still going to use the information you get. You're still going to do the best with what you have. But in the meantime, you want to go ahead and continue to educate your doctors. And the best way to educate anyone in general, scientific fact, is to do so in small bites given frequently. So quick, short memos to that doctor's office, talking to staff repeatedly, but in short clips here and there, just throw it out there every once in a while. Hey, did you know? Hey, here's another fact. And just doing that frequently, but quickly over time, as opposed to our old model where we probably were in the doctor's office saying, I need an hour of your time. I'm going to give you a full in-service where I lay out exactly what I do and exactly why orthoses and prostheses are important and exactly what kind of notes I need from you. And I'm going to do that one time this year, and then I may or may not return a year later or maybe 2 years later and do it again. Or, that kind of setup, that way of instructing people is just not, it doesn't fit the way we practice right now. It doesn't fit the way doctors practice right now. I mean, the bottom line of what needs to be in that doctor's notes are some relatively simple things that are pretty doable. And maybe it doesn't have to be a huge undertaking for the doctor or a huge change in the way they handle things. If we take it at its very, very bare bones, what is required in those doctor's notes is that they talk to the patient about the orthosis. We just need that doctor to mention the orthosis, to have a conversation with the patient about the orthosis. They need to know, what did they get in the past? Did they use something else? Are they happy with this new style? Do they want something different? And what are the patient's goals? That's pretty simple stuff. They also need to know how long they're going to need it. Is this forever or is this temporary? Pretty simple. And then the functional use. Once you get that brace, what are you going to do with it? So that is our webinar today. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you to SPS for sponsoring these webinars, for making them possible, and for putting it out there for their customers so that they can be more successful in their business. It's huge for that. As usual, a huge thank you also to the practitioner who let me use his cases for this webinar so that everyone can benefit from his, his issues that he's seen and his fixes that he's implemented. So I very much appreciate that. And please, if you have any cases that you're working on that are confusing or difficult, or you want more information, contact me. You can email me at the address there. You can call me. And as I always say, that number is the SPS number, extension 5. However, that extension will ring straight to my cell phone, so you get me directly. And then if you're on Twitter, you can find me also at Molly Documents as my Twitter address or handle or whatever they call it. I'm not a Twitter expert, but I'm working on it. So anyway, please do contact me with any questions or issues. This, I feel like, was a fairly controversial sort of webinar, so I'd love to hear your feedback, whether you liked it or didn't, if you disagree with what I'm saying, and I will try to get that into the next webinar, or post it on Twitter, or put it out as an email if we have enough comments, so that everyone can benefit from your comments or your questions, or if you have contradictory experience to that, we want to be able to share that with everybody. Thanks so much for attending.